All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Lightbox Expo 2021. I am absolutely honored to welcome my very accomplished friend here. From things like The Croods, or How to Train Your Dragon, or my favorite, Lilo and Stitch. Um, our next presenter has directed all these things, including created Lilo and Stitch. Without further ado, the amazing, the incredible Christopher Sanders. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Fantastic. Take it away.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Um, if I present something over and over again, I get really good at it, but this will be the first time I did this, so it may not be great, but we'll do our best. So I want to talk first about like just how I got into this whole thing. How did I become a director? And part of this, I'm going to repeat a little bit that I did on a podcast yesterday with the Bancroft brothers, and hopefully this will be the only thing I repeat from that, in case you tuned into that. But when I got into animation, it was as a development artist. Disney was not hiring, and I heard from a friend, my roommate Leon, who was working at Disney, that they had an opening. So I created a portfolio to try to get in this one position that they had open. Created a portfolio that I was hopeful that was appropriate for presentation, and as it turns out, I was hired. Apparently, it came down to two people, and I was the cheaper option, so I got in. Um, and then I began to work in development. So apparently, nobody at that time really knew what a development department really did. And I certainly didn't know either. So I think I actually got an ulcer during that time. My stomach would hurt at work and at night because I was so nervous. I didn't want to lose this job. Um, and what I would do is I would illustrate what I felt were key moments from the stories that they were coming up with. And what I didn't realize was that this was my first little jump into story. And that's the main thing about this whole thing. The main point of this whole thing is, for me, but I would argue for others as well, um, if you want to direct, the place you should start is story. And if you're not working in story, do your best to learn about story, spend as much time in story as possible, because that, for me, is the key to everything. Story is a hub. Everything else radiates out from it. Everything in movies is going to radiate out from story. So I was doing drawings, and what I didn't realize was I was actually drawing moments from the film that I felt were interesting, was being drawn to the parts of these stories that were turning points in the story. So I was working on drawings for the Rescuers Down Under, which was just being developed. They were boarding on it, and they said, "Hey, can you do some development drawings for this little bit at the very beginning where these mice in Australia want to send a signal to New York City?" And I said, "Great." And I went to the research library and I found a globe, because at the top of the globe had a little time dial, and it would tell you the time zones, like day or night, wherever you could turn it. And I thought, well, if they sent a signal from Australia in the afternoon, what time would it be in New York City? Would it be day or night? That was basically the only question I had, was would it be nighttime? And as I was looking at this globe, I couldn't help but notice there were all these little islands that fell between Australia and and New York City. It was very far away. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if these little mice couldn't just signal that easily? What if they had to bounce the signal from place to place? So I did these drawings of little mice that were in different places, like some mice in Hawaii and some mice that were like keeping a radio in an old crashed World War II fighter running on one of these little islands in the Pacific. And I did this bit where they were bouncing the signal. And the directors liked it enough that the producer came to me and he said, "Hey, Chris, would you storyboard this sequence?" Well, my only experience with storyboarding was what I had seen at Marvel Productions. That was my first job. That did not look, it wasn't just that it didn't look fun. It was just so difficult looking. And they did these little tiny drawings on these pre-made boards. And I was like, no, 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 I can't do that. I can't board. And they said, okay. Um, then he came back later, producer came back and he said, "Hey, Chris, we know you don't want to board this or can't, whatever. But would you do all the drawings that fall between the ones that you already did? And I said, oh, I can do that. So they gave me a story pad and I started doing these little drawings. And to help me, I found a piece of music because there was no dialogue in the sequence. And the piece of music that I found was a John Williams um, a score that he had done for the Olympics. He scored a couple different Olympics, and I think this was the first one that he scored. I had it on a CD, and I listened to it all the time. And it was this really sort of triumphant, powerful piece of music. So I boarded, and I put my headphones on, and I boarded to that. Didn't know I was boarding. And I did all these drawings. I gave them to the producer, and he said, "This is great. Would you put these drawings on a storyboard, hang them all up, and then we'll give you a stick and you can point at them and you can show everybody what you did." And I said, okay, I can do that. And so I did this thing. I turned the music on and I pointed to all the drawings. And after I was done, they said, "That's great. Can you do that for a different part of the film?" And I said, "Okay, I can do that." So I did that, and I would say I was about 2 or 3 boards in before I realized, "Oh my gosh, they tricked me. I'm storyboarding." And I loved it. I really, really liked it. Um, so that was my transition by accident into storyboarding. And that period of time after Rescuers Down Under, I went on to Beauty and the Beast. And I would say that my time on Beauty and the Beast was the most concentrated period of learning I ever had. I was so fortunate to be amongst what I would consider to be some of the greatest story artists ever. Joe Ranft, Ed Gombert, Roger Allers, Brenda Chapman. Um, our producer was Don Hahn. Bernie Mattinson was there. Joe Grant was there. And it was amazing. And what we would do is we would get our sequences, we would spend the week boarding, and then on Fridays, we would all get together and whoever was ready would pitch their boards. And it was this super interactive thing. Back then, we'd put everything on boards. You could see the entire sequence at once. And what I learned was that story was something that fairly hard won. It's like it was nothing was really super simple. And it was more dimensional. It was more like a sculpture than anything. And there were huge discussions after we pitched these boards. And the thing that amongst the things I learned was to play nice in the sandbox. Like nobody ever shut the conversation down. And I would watch people like Ed Gombert or Joe Ranft. And every time we hit a roadblock and we got stuck, rather than being frustrated, they would find ways around it, or they would remove that thing and toss it out, and we'd start again. So I learned so much during that period of time. Um, my transition from boarding to writing came on Mulan, because in that room with everybody on Beauty and the Beast, we did a lot of writing. We just didn't sit down and do it on a typewriter or in a computer, but you would change dialogue and do those things. So my philosophy of storyboarding that I learned on Beauty and the Beast is that you leave it better than you got it. I really believe that the transition from the written page to the board is the biggest transition there is. Every time I got pages, I would look at them. I'm like, oh, this doesn't work because it looks good on the page, but when you start boarding it, you're like, well, oh, holy mackerel! Like these things, just engineering wise, have to be changed around, and and so I would be so frustrated with these scripts. Now, I will say that when I finally did start writing on Lilo and Stitch, I sat down with my own pages and the same thing happened. I would look at them and go, well, this doesn't work. This is no good. You can't have to change all of this. So it's not necessarily the writers. It's just a really big jump. It's a big transition. On Mulan, it was such a long project. It was 6 years, longest project I ever worked on. And in those 6 years, we went through different writers, and we spent so much time on this whole thing. You would end up writing whole pieces just because it was expedient, and there was so many people doing so many different things. A really good example of something that I wrote is when Mulan is sitting with her father after this huge disaster with the matchmaker. I was trying to figure out what her dad would say to her. And I ended up writing that because everything that came to mind at first was either completely mundane or like, oh, I'm sorry you feel bad, don't give up, all these things that just like they just were not attractive and they were boring, or they were off ramps into tedium and they were going to start a longer conversation. And what I finally decided was, and this is my style, which is I don't talk about the thing at hand, I talk about something else that pertains. So I did this little bit where he says, he doesn't say really anything. And then he says, look at these blossoms. Oh, look, aren't they beautiful? Look, this one is late, but I bet when it blooms, it'll be the most beautiful of all. So he makes her feel better, and it's extremely efficient. It doesn't start a conversation, it's self contained. At the end of Mulan, at the end of this 6 years, I had written enough stuff that, and I have to thank the directors and the producer decided that I had earned a writing credit. So on Mulan, as a story artist, as a head of story, I actually got a writing credit. Now, it's really hard to say what a writer is. If you write, you're a writer. I mean, you could argue that you're getting paid for it, you're a writer, but writing is something that anybody can do, and I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic thing. It gave me enough confidence, and I think the studio just enough confidence that when it came time for my next project, they asked me, is there anything you would like to do? Is there anything you would like to direct? And that's a whole other story, but that is what started Lilo and Stitch. Dean and I worked with Dean on Mulan, on Lilo and Stitch, on How to Train Your Dragon. He's my favorite person to work with. Um, we decided, like, well, we'll try to write it. Like, why hire a writer if we know these characters? No one knows the characters better than we do. In fact, that was a huge motivation for me. Like, well, I know what Stitch would do. I know what Lilo would do. I'll just write it, because I would get into a situation where I'd be maybe arguing with the writer. Like, no, she wouldn't do this. She would do that. Well, heck, well, I know what they're going to do. I'll just write it. The studio was initially nervous about that. I remember they said, okay, you can start writing, and if there's any problem, we're going to hire a writer. Um, so we got a heads up a couple different times from one of the development guys who said, okay, just letting you know, the pages, they're okay. They really feel like they're lacking in this or that. And so we got these really nice little heads up from development that helped us go back, make some corrections. So it ended up that they never replaced us as writers. And that was also my step into directing, because again, I think I had done enough things on Mulan that they trusted me with the idea of directing a movie. So that was really something that I just earned it. I never really sat down and said, I want to direct. I'd worked hard enough on these things that they offered them up. And this is the other core thing that I would like to say. This is, once again, maybe the ultimate proof of this whole thing. When I moved into directing, neither Dean or I had ever done that. And we actually talked about it. Like, well, how are we going to do this? I don't know how to do layouts. I am not a good animator. I don't know anything about moving a camera. I've never recorded anybody before. So in a sense, you're working with actors twice. You're working with an actor in a room who's going to do the recording, and then you're going to work with animators, and they are also the actors in this whole scenario. And then it came to us, the only way we're going to be able to do this is to stay where we belong in story. We made the decision that no matter what we're doing, we will just simply sit where we belong in story and do everything from there. Meaning, if we sit with an actor, we're going to tell them what the scene needs. We're going to stay in story, and then they're going to do what they're going to do. And another good example would be animators. Like, I don't feel comfortable telling an animator, and I have no business telling an animator, well, I think you should move their ear like this and their nose like this, and all this. No, we made the decision. We would pitch the scene to the animator. That animator will do his job. And when he brings the scene back, if it doesn't look like it was looking in my head, but it accomplishes the goal, then we are done. We're done and we'll move on. And that became the thing with everybody, with layout, with camera, with the actors. If they do it their way, but it works and it fulfills, if it checks the box, we're done. And that's the other thing. So that's the main, if there's anything you take away from this whole thing, it is that story will keep you safe. So, so what is story? When I was at CalArts, I took a story writing class, and I literally had no idea what to do. And I asked the teacher at the very beginning, I said, I have a really stupid question. What is story? And he told me something I never forgot. He said, oh, that's easy. Story is change. So, story is a character that changes from beginning to end, or a character that changes the world around them, or a character who changes and changes the world around them. I would say a really good example of the first one would be Lion King, because Simba is a character who he stays fairly constant through the film, but he for different reasons runs away from a responsibility he's destined to embrace, and the story changes him. It forces him to confront who he is and head back and take over the Pride Lands and become the king that he was supposed to be. A really great example of the second, a character who changes the world around them, would be Mulan. Mulan is a constant, and she changes the world around her. The story in Mulan, she's a girl who so loved her father that she was willing to risk her life, her honor, and everything just to save his life. So she is a constant, and by the end of the film, she's changed the world. I would say Lilo and Stitch is a good example of the third, because the whole basis of Lilo and Stitch came from the final days of Mulan. I was walking around the halls and I said, isn't it funny how many minutes and hours we spend talking about how to kill a villain? People would probably be surprised how much discussion goes on in the halls of Disney animation. Well, how are we going to kill this guy? Like with the Shan Yu, like with like should he fall? It's like, a lot of them fall. How about if we we came up with the idea that he would be, driven into a fireworks stand and it would be this spectacular explosion. And it got me thinking, like, do we always have to kill a villain? And then I thought, well, what if we redeemed a villain? And at the very core and base of Lilo and Stitch is the idea of a villain becoming the hero. So Stitch changes throughout the film, and he changes the world around him because there's this family that is on the brink of falling apart, that he accelerates that and then ultimately saves it. So story is change. If you're working on something and things aren't changing, you might want to take a look at that. It is kind of interesting how many people might embark. I've seen this happen. They embark on creating a film, kind of based on like stuff they like and or like they want to say something, which is fine. But sometimes like saying something isn't enough. You need something that will involve people. When I first started working in animation, I don't know if you've heard this, but a lot of people talk about theme. This is all related. People would say, well, what's the theme? What's the theme? And I've always argued that I couldn't tell you the theme of anything I've worked on beyond believe in yourself. And I really don't think that that's a basis for doing anything. You've got theme, you've got story. Story is something that you should be able to pitch. People talk about an elevator pitch. You should be able to encapsulate what you're going to talk about or what you're going to make in just a few sentences. It should be that lean. I would argue that a theme is not going to get anybody in a theater. The other thing I hear a lot about, relatability. Okay, relatability is not a bad thing. It's something I've heard a lot in the last decade. Is it relatable? Is it relatable? Relatability, again, is great. If you're making a story about a mom or a dad, it's going to really speak to moms and dads out there. Most of the movies I like, I can't relate to in the least. I relate to nothing in Star Wars, nothing in Rogue One, nothing in Lion King. I am not a lion. I'm not a king. I don't have the problems he has. But all these things do share one thing: they are compelling. And that's what your simple story should be. It should be compelling. That's the main thing. Like, I go to movie theaters to see things that are outside of my experience. I want to escape my life. And so again, find things that are compelling. Okay. So what I did was I boiled down this whole thing as I work, and this relates to story, as I work on a story, as I direct, and as we develop the story in boarding, and as we put it into production, I boiled it down to 10 things that I have dealt with. 10 things that I would say would be things to think about. And number one Make a list of expectations. So I'll use Croods as an example. Like, I'm always thinking about the finished film. So when we started Croods, it's a caveman film. Okay, nobody's a caveman. So if you go to see a caveman film, okay, I love cavemen. People love cavemen. What do you want to see? And I sat down with Kirk D'Amico, who's another collaborator that I love to work with, and we actually sat down and said, okay, what do people expect if they come in to see this movie? Like if you're making a car racing movie, if you're making a movie about somebody who flies jet planes, this is cavemen. What would people come out and be like, oh man, I went to see a caveman film and they didn't do X? Like, okay, we literally sat down and said, I want to see people who are really tough and can be thrown against a wall and they can handle it. I want to see a mammoth. I want to see lava. I want to see a volcano. I want to see the earth crack open. I want to see earthquakes. And so we made this just giant list of things. And the really cool thing about that is you will encounter things by making these lists like, oh, I never thought about X. Like, well, how do we, and it doesn't mean that you have to make a huge left or right turn. Like, well, we didn't hit lava. We got to find it. It's just really helpful. If you get a few things on that list, you'll be doing great. I actually had a great conversation with Chris Montan after Finding Nemo had come out. And Finding Nemo was a powerhouse. It was so amazing and it was so popular. And and afterwards, he said to me, he said, I really feel like if you make a movie and it has 3 great moments, you have a chance of having a really good hit film. And I thought that's pretty true. Like if you have 3 great moments, something that people will come out and go, oh my gosh, this thing happened. Who's going to, what are people going to talk about? So make a list of expectations no matter what you're doing, and it'll help you discover the stuff you should be doing. It'll start discussions. Number 2, start at the end. Okay. I'm constantly thinking about how my film's going to end. And I have a couple things to say about this. How do you want people to feel at the end of this film? Do you want people to be terrified? Do you want people to feel like they are renewed? Do you want people to be sobbing? I mean, literally, how do you want people to feel? In Lilo and Stitch, I wanted this moment. I wanted this moment that would break people's hearts when at the moment of truth, this rotten character suddenly changes. And I thought, I want a character that's so powerful that when he goes from bad to good, he is unstoppable. He is as unstoppable when he's a good character as when he's a bad character. And that's where this whole rescue came up, and that's a whole other story that he used to hijack an airplane, believe it or not. He threw people off this airplane, he stole an airplane. But the idea that this guy is so unstoppable that he could he could drive a truck into a lava field, a gasoline truck, and set it off. And this is where his indestructible nature really pays off. Yeah. So I'm always thinking about the end. The other thing I would say is if you're thinking about the end of your film, I would advise to be very careful that it doesn't just become a good guy beating up a bad guy. There's got to be more than that going on, because any film I've worked on, I've worked very hard that the end of the film is not quite the end of the film. Mulan, Lilo and Stitch, How to Train Your Dragon, these are all really good examples of that. In How to Train Your Dragon, we knew that he was going to eventually, Hiccup and Toothless were eventually going to face off against that giant dragon. And you see that coming. Hopefully you're anticipating that. But when they finished that up, you still didn't know what was going to happen, because there was still the issue of how will people feel about the dragon? What happened to Hiccup? And that's where the whole thing with his foot came to be, because it felt a little bit too pat that he go through this incredible thing and he come out of it unscathed. In Mulan, she faces off against the Shan Yu, but there's still the question of how are people going to react to her? How is the emperor going to react? How is her father going to react? How will the how will the little guys inside that temple, the guardians, how will the guardians react to Mushu? So there's still more story to unspool at the end of the film, and I would highly recommend you try for something like that, because if it's just bad guy versus good guy, If that's all it is, then it has to be the most amazing, ingenious fight, if that's the end of the film. But look for something that's a little bit deeper. Okay. Number 3, find your landmarks. When I was working on Beauty and the Beast, we went to Fishkill to work with Howard Ashman, and Howard was going to be writing the music for the film. Howard Ashman is one of the sharpest story people I've ever met. We sat with him for 2 days, and he was literally saying, "Okay, let's," we're getting down to like the very, very beginning of the story, the basis of the story, and he said, "Well, what is the deal with Belle? Because I need to write this song where we introduce her." And he said, you know, with Little Mermaid, part of your world could have been and was temporarily titled, I Want Feet. She's just saying over and over again, I wish I had feet. I want to go to the land. I wish I had feet. So what's the deal with Belle? And the best that we could come up with was that to the rest of the town, Belle was weird. She was a strange person to them, right? To us, she's like smart and normal, but to this town, she's kind of weird. She like reads books all the time, and that was good enough. And we fought for more, but that was pretty much what we had. And at the end of the first day, I said, I have a dumb question. How do you know where to put the songs? And Howard said, oh, that's easy. You put them at the story turns. And I'm like, oh my God. And again, another revelation. So Howard Ashman was searching through the story to find like where to put the music. That was the main thing he was doing. I always thought of it as those little poles with the flags that are stuck in the snow that skiers go around when they're doing downhill racing. He puts the story in a Howard Ashman created musical will turn within the song. A good example of that would be when she goes to visit the Sea Witch, and Ursula sings this song. Ariel comes in to that song with a tail, and she leaves with legs. Huge story turn. Part of your world, nothing turns within that song, but right after she sings that song, her dad catches her in that grotto. He destroys everything, and that's what sends her to the Sea Witch. So that is so emblematic of every sequence in the film. Every sequence has got to contribute. It's got to turn the story in some way. If it doesn't, it'll be taken out. I'll tell you something about that in a second. But the music it goes in the story turns. So you want to find your landmarks. You want to find your story turns. That's what the outlining process is all about. Outlining is not the most fun thing in the world. On Croods, we spent a year outlining the film, but after we finally got it outlined, a good outline, you should be able to take all the sequences, hand it to different people to write. Like if you have a co-writer, you should just divvy them up. You can write your sequence, and no matter what, the story will turn within the sequence and it will work. A good example of the opposite. When I was working on Beauty and the Beast, I was given the sequence where Belle escapes and she runs away, which is a little bit odd. It was always a little odd because she promises to take her father's place, and pretty much the first thing she does is she's like, I'm out of here, and she runs away, and she's hunted down by wolves. And so I was like, oh, I was so excited because, imagine a sequence where you're trying to escape a castle where everything is alive. Oh, it'll be so cool. So I worked really, really hard, and the candelabras are alive, and the footstool is alive, and the paintings in the hall, they're alive. And so this whole thing, and she's being really quiet and working her way around things. And I came in really early on that Friday morning to pitch my sequence. Bertie Mattinson was the first one who came in, and he had his coffee cup with his little straw that he sipped from. And I said, oh, hey, Bernie, would you mind if I pitch this for practice? And he goes, oh, yeah, go ahead. So I had at least 3 storyboards worth of drawings, and I pitched through it, did my very best. I'd been practicing, and each of these boards has like 70 some odd drawings on it. I got to the last drawing, and I turned around and I said, okay. And he's like, I have a suggestion. And I said, oh, yeah, well, please, by all means. And he said, I think you could cut from here. And he went to, I swear, the 3rd drawing. I think you could cut from here to and he went down the first board, then he stepped to the second board, and he went to the third board, and he went to the last line, to the last drawing, and said, "Here." And to my horror, the lights came on in my mind. I'm like, this entire sequence is a waste of time. It doesn't matter how she gets out of the castle. She just needs to leave. So the directors came in, the rest of the story people came in. I was completely discouraged. I'm like, I just wasted all my time, and I'm about to pitch a sequence that Bernie has rightfully pointed out is completely useless. So I pitched it, and I think I was the first one to say, however, as Bernie has pointed out, I pointed to like the third drawing, and then I went to the last one. I said, you can cut from here to here, which is exactly what they did. So that's an example of something that was way too linear. I worried about the reflection song in Mulan. I felt it was relatively linear, um, but I was quite in the minority on that, and I have come to see the wisdom of the directors leaving that in, because it's a really emotional moment, and it's certainly a moment that has delighted people and ended up in trailers and stuff like that, despite being a bit linear at that moment. Okay, number 4, beware sidekicks. Villains have sidekicks because they need someone to talk to. Villains know what they're doing for the most part, and they just literally need someone to talk to. Sidekicks, I would put in the category of the kind of stuff as a director that you can be tempted to put in a story, um, and you can do too much of it. You only have so much time in a film. I worked on a short at Disney that never got made because the writers put 19 characters into it, and it was only a 20-minute short. So if the characters had spoken nonstop, every character would have had less than 1 minute on screen. And the first thing I noticed was like, we can't even make this. Like, it's just a confusing blob of just nothing because there's just too much in it. So beware extraneous characters and beware stuff that's just super, super, super fun that, again, just ultimately does not move the story forward. And that relates to number 5, maneuvering room. Um, One of the things that Kirk D'Amico told me on Crudes was that we're really, really fortunate. We have a 30-minute story, or we have a 60-minute story inside a 90-minute film. And this is where that being brutally honest about and brutally and just brutal about removing things that just are not 100% necessary. Um, it's good for you. If they're great, people will complain and they'll say, "Hey, where'd that thing go that I loved so much?" And that's fine. You can put things back in the story process, but be brutal about taking things out that do not belong in the story. I can tell you that this is where Pixar really shines. We took Lilo and Stitch up there for them to see, and it was the toughest day we had because their culture is it's really unforgiving, not in a bad way. They will put your story to the test. So they put that in their vice of story nonsense, and they squeezed it to get all this nonsensical stuff out of it, right? And it was a really tough day because there's a lot of stuff that was the stuff we loved, but one of the things that came out of that whole thing was we were forced to go back and examine several places in the film that we couldn't really defend. And you spend a lot of time in story defending things you like, but then through your defense, you have to come up with a real reason that it's in the story. You can't just be like, "Well, I like it. I like dancing, right? I like juggling. I've always wanted to see a character do X. I've always wanted to see a character do Y. These are not good enough. It has to really be in there for a reason." And it's a hard process to cut things out and cut things down. But I would say Pixar is a proof that through that process, there are gifts you earn by taking out stuff that doesn't belong. And again, by taking that stuff out, you buy yourself time. And one of the things I would say that Pixar and many Disney films as well have done beautifully is they are beautifully paced. They have the room to let things just be, to let a moment breathe, and to let the audience feel. Um, a related story would be How to Train Your Dragon. On Lilo and Stitch, when we went to score the film, I realized that the orchestra was constantly having to duck under dialogue that kept flying by. By the time you get to the orchestra, it's way too late to change stuff, right? So in How to Train Your Dragon, we built little houses for music. A good example would be the Forbidden Friendship sequence, where Hiccup ends up alone in that cove with Toothless. We always knew we were going to have this, like, Dean and I were very inspired by the sequence in Black Stallion, where the same thing happens, where this boy has this whole sequence with this horse. They had the time to let that sequence be as big as it needed to be. And it's an incredible sequence. It's the heart of the film. And I would argue that the first How to Train Your Dragon, one of the big hearts of the film, is that sequence. And we wouldn't have had time to do that sequence had we not been brutal about taking everything else out. I would say that I could give you examples of films that are not terrible films, but you can tell by watching them they're working really hard to keep up with themselves because they just have so much stuff they have to get through. And so they're very difficult pace-wise. Number 6, see movies. While you're making a movie, for me, go see movies. There are so many times on a movie that you end up solitary, boarding, writing, or just in a room with a ton of people, but you're working on, like, okay, how are we going to solve this one problem? And you start getting closer and closer and closer to the movie. And I would say that Jeffrey Katzenberg's greatest power was that he would come in and he would yank you back and force you to look at the entire thing and and remind you that you're making something that is supposed to be big and epic and audacious in its feelings, or, you know, even if it's subtle, like, it still should have audacious things going on. And the best way for me to do that and to reset myself, or to even, like, get out of a problem, is to go see a movie. And great movies, or even, like, okay movies, they can just reset in your head what a movie is. Again, you can get so into these details. And I'll be, like, facing a problem. I can't figure it out. I'll go to see a movie, and all of a sudden, like, oh, wait a minute. This is supposed to be kind of fun. It's supposed to be a ride. It reminds you of what a movie is. While I was watching a movie, it came to me, the whole bit about the badness level in Stitch just, like, jumped into my head. I was watching a movie that had nothing to do with it. And all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, movies are fun. And then all of a sudden, like, all these scenes kind of broke loose in my head, and I could go back and write them and add things in that I thought were nonsensical, but really good for the character, and they were going to stay in the film. So that would help. It helps you break loose. Okay. In a related issue, number 7, watch the trailer. And I'm completely serious about watching the trailer for the film that you're working on that isn't finished yet. Go to Apple Trailers, watch trailers for any movie, and it does the same thing. It not only resets you, but it reminds you that it's okay to build, as you're building the film and you're directing the film, it's okay to deliberately be aware of, like, oh, this could be great in a trailer. There are so many times in a film, a character will be like, in a trailer, somebody will say, are you saying we're going to fly that spaceship through the black hole? Are you crazy? And, like, oh, you know, they just, boom, they just say it, you know? And it's fun because the things they put in a trailer are the things that are going to make you feel the most excited, terrified, emotional. And it just, again, it gets you in the right frame. Even as you're boarding a sequence, a single sequence, go see trailers and think about your trailer. How's your trailer going to look? And what do you want people to see? It's a great reset. Number 8, don't get discouraged. While we were working on Lion King, I would argue that nobody would have said at the beginning that that film was going to be what it was at the end. That was an original film. There was no model for it. I remember that, and I was on it early on, and it was a hard-won thing. And it was the people who worked on it that made it what it is. And there are so many stories within this. But I will say that a couple times working on it, I had these sobering moments and thought, what in the heck are we doing here? I was in Disney World because a good deal of the film was made in Florida. I was in Disney World and it was night, and I loved going over to Epcot to just wander around. And I was having dinner in the Japan zone um, of Epcot, and you are compelled at this one restaurant to sit with strangers. I was sitting at a table with a bunch of people, and we were like, they said, "Oh, everybody should go around and say who they are and what they're doing and whatever." And so came around to me, and I said, "Oh, well, I'm here working on an animated film," and they got really excited, and they started naming films they'd heard of. Is it Pocahontas? And I was like, no, no. And they named a few others that they'd heard of. And finally they said, well, what are you working on? And I said, I'm working on Lion King. And they said, oh, what's that? And I said, it's a movie about a lion who's a king. And they're like, oh, okay. Oh, that's nice. At that point, I didn't have anything else to say. And I was like, oh. And the other time, I think we had like this, while we were working on the Warthog song, a bunch of us were sitting around a table just wrestling with the Warthog song. And somebody ran in and said, oh, Aladdin just finished one of their sequences. They're going to show it in the theater. It happened to be the Prince Ali musical sequence, which is an amazing bit of animation. It's an amazing song. We went to see it. We sat in the theater. They did the whole Prince Ali thing. And of course, it reaches this crescendo, and it's like, Prince Ali, glorious he. And it's like, wow, color and stuff. And it was so cool. And we went back to our building and sat down. And I was looking at these drawings I was doing of a warthog, and I'm like, what are we doing? It's like, what? It's the warthog song. What are we doing? But you know what? I have to say, this is where, like, everybody I was working with, Don Hahn, never lost focus on this whole thing, never lost hope. There were these weird moments where you were like, what are we doing? You're really searching. But then, eventually came the day where it started to really gel and coalesce. And you're like, oh, this could be something really cool. And of course, it ended up being what it was. Okay, number 9. Listen to the story. As you direct, storyboard, the film is going to your story is eventually going to reach the point where it is telling you what it wants. I always liken this to, you start with a bunch of wheels and steel and metal and some tracks, and you're trying to build this train, and you push it and you push it and you push it, and eventually it starts to build up steam and it starts to move, and then it starts to go faster and faster and faster, and eventually, by the time you get to the point where you're showing people sequences and you're showing people the finished film or story reels, test audiences, you have had many times where the film has begun to report to you what it doesn't want or what it needs. And this is where you have to be a really good listener, and you have to put your ego aside. And if the film hates the thing you're doing, you have to get rid of it. I can't tell you that there have been many films I've worked on where we haven't eventually reached a point where we've shut the film down, we've taken a step back and said, okay, what are we doing? And these are with amazing story people and amazing directors. And you can still get to a point where you're like, whoa, what are we doing? What are we doing? If the whole thing starts to steer the wrong way. And things that bump can be things you need to take out, things you fix, or they can actually be things that are good and they're so original that they're already showing themselves to be so. So a good example of that would be on Lilo and Stitch. People were complaining. They said, we have 2 montages back to back. You have to take one of them out. And I'd say, well, which one would you take out? Because we had a bit where Nani was going out and she was job hunting. That was a musical montage. We rolled directly into a surfing montage. And people would say, well, you should take the second one out where she looks for a job. And I was like, no, the second one is the surfing thing. And they're like, huh? There was enough confusion as to which was the one to take out. We left it in long enough to get to a test audience. Even though it was a back-to-back montage, the second one, the surfing one, was the most popular thing in the entire film. And you could take this big pile of the cards that people filled out and the little question that said, what is your favorite part of this film? you could roll through the pages, and the word surfing was in the same spot. Surfing, surfing, surfing. We could make a whole film about surfing, and it would have been hugely popular. So you'll eventually get to the point where the story is going to tell you, and that at that point the story was telling us, leave it alone, don't touch it. Lastly, music, music, music. I never bored without music. Music that I've used to guide me from the very first thing I boarded on Rescuers Down Under. Music has guided me unerringly to good places. A lot of times the music I have set a sequence to has influenced the final music in the film. A good example of that would be Beauty and the Beast, the transformation sequence. I had this wonderful little piece of music that when the moment came to transform, there was this little violin da 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 da. If you listen to the music in the final film, it mimics that almost perfectly at the moment where the rain starts turning magical. And I'm talking too much. I'm running out of time. So the last thing I'll say is a really a memorable moment in that realm. I was boarding the sequence where Simba was going to be confronted by the ghost of his father, and I was immensely excited, and I felt the pressure of doing a good job on this thing, and I showed it the first time, and Roger was like, the upshot was good but not great. So I went away and I thought, I have to really elevate this whole thing. I found a piece of music. There are several pieces of animation. I could direct you to a piece of music. You could turn the music off in the animation, play this piece of music over it, and it would fit pretty darn well. In the case of that transformation sequence and the ghost sequence, there was a movie called The Mission, and there's a track that is the title track. It's called The Mission, and I set that sequence to that piece of music, and it really helped me elevate it in the boards. And I pitched it to Roger and Rob, and they were like, it was a sale. They liked it. Later on at the premiere, we were in New York City. We were at the premiere, and Don Hahn came to get me, and he said, "Hey Chris, come here a second." And he said, "Here's Hans Zimmer. He wants to talk to you." And I said hi and stuff, and he said, "He's the one that did that ghost sequence." And Hans had a cigarette. Hans had a cigarette, and pardon my language here, but Hans had a cigarette, and he said, "Yes." He said, "I have a request. In the future, could you please choose a shittier piece of music? That is one of my favorite pieces of music of all time, and it was a real challenge to try to follow that up." So I was like, mission accomplished. I found a great piece of music for that. So I could go on and on about music and what I've learned about it. But I see we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to stop and open this up.
Sure, absolutely. And of course, for those of you that are just coming in or you missed a few things, we're talking with the one and only director Chris Sanders. And so, Chris, we have a bunch of questions coming in. I love this first one. It comes from Grace. Grace asks, how do you pitch an idea that's strange? I often think about how a movie like Lilo and Stitch was pitched because there's nothing like it before.
I was very fortunate in some ways. No matter who you're pitching to, find the part of the film that will move people. Find the point. Why are you making it? If it's like, oh, I like rabbits and I'm making a movie about rabbits, that's not going to sell anything. It has to be about, again, the change. What is the change? What are people going to feel? It's okay to just lay it out in a pitch. I want people to feel this. I want people to come out of this film and feel brave and feel renewed. It's okay, because a lot of times you're like, oh, I want to imply that people should feel a certain way. But in the early days, it's okay to just say it to your executives or your crew. I want them to feel this. Lilo and Stitch was interesting because they, when I first pitched it to Tom Schumacher, who I credit with the reason that film even exists, because Tom understood that it was an extremely subtle story. And one of the first things after I pitched the outline, and Dean and I put an outline together, I pitched an original concept. I created like a little storybook I knew that I was pitching a film about aliens. At that time, alien films were all about terror and, frightening stuff. And I thought, this is very different. I was concerned that the word alien would be heard the wrong way by Tom and the development department. So I thought, okay, if they say no to this, I want them to say no for the right reasons. So I created basically a little children's book. I went to Palm Springs for a few days. I stayed in a hotel room, ordered room service, drank a lot of cappuccino, and just did nothing but write and drew all these little pages. They saw it. Tom said, I want to make this film. But early on, when we pitched the outline, Tom said to Dean and I, this film is too fragile. It will not hold up to the kind of pressure the studio is going to put on it. His solution was to hide it. He said, we're going to hide this. We're not going to show the studio what we're doing. We're going to hide this away until it is strong enough to withstand the kind of scrutiny and pressure the studio is going to put on it. And so Lilo and Stitch was like, it would be like you were building a spy plane. It was in its hangar. It never was shown to the studio. I believe that Michael Eisner never saw it until it was in color, and we premiered it. Well, not premiered it, but we showed it at a test screening in Las Vegas, nearly finished. And that was the moment of proof to what Tom was saying, because we came out of the screening, and Michael Eisner called Dean and I over, and he said, I like this movie. I don't really know how to explain it, but I mean, I like it. It's really weird, and well, it's odd, but I like it. It's just hard to explain. And he was really struggling to really get his hands around it, but he kept interrupting himself to say, but I like it. So that was proof that had it been seen early on by too many people, it would have just gotten crushed. Because people would have been like, wait, an alien an alien in Hawaii? It's too weird. So part of it is luck, and part of it was showing it to the right people. And that person was Tom Schumacher.
That's fantastic. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's take another question if that's all right. We'll go to this one. Comes from Anonymous, but it's a great question. Anonymous asks, why is it so important to cut out scenes that aren't relevant to the story? Why can't enjoyable scenes just kind of like stay in there for sake of entertainment or creating depth?
Mm-hmm. You know what? You can possibly get away with a little bit of that, not a lot. A lot of that will just start boring people because your story is not unspooling. It's not moving forward. Again, every film is different. And if you want to have a song sequence or something just because you think it's really, really cool and neat, put it in and see how it plays. It may play great. I mean, you could argue that surfing could have been taken out of Lilo and Stitch. Now, surfing had a reason to be there because we put them out in the water specifically because at the end of that sequence, that was how we were going to cause this massive disaster that would turn the story. That was the last straw, and it was going to ultimately destroy the family that Stitch had joined. Right? So you can go for that, go for it. And again, down the line, you can a lot. I have held sequences in place with story scaffolding and insisted that they stay for a while, and they've eventually just fallen away because you're ultimately like, I don't know why we're ultimately, as you watch the movie over and over again, I guarantee you yourself will start to get annoyed and bored by something you put in that you used to love. And you used to, this is the best thing ever. And finally you're like, this is just dumb. It's making me crazy. Please get rid of it.
I actually have a question myself, Chris. You know, a lot of times when you're trying to develop something, or you write stuff as well, do people ever ask you to see your script before the first draft is done? Like you only have act one, and if so, how do you feel about that? Like I would hate that because you can't tell the full thing, but it happens so much. I wonder, you know.
Yeah. I would say that I've never showed anything without at least having enough of the outline so people can see the rough shape of it, so that when it's like the dinosaurs support structures in place, even though all the bones aren't up there yet. And to at least be able to say, this is how this is going to end. It's going to end by people feeling this way, and this character is going to triumph or decide that they're going to change their life. So they at least know enough that when they read this thing, they can hopefully place it into the bigger picture, even though it's only one tile in a big mosaic. So I just by having enough of the outline that hopefully they can see the larger thing.
You know, the other thing I want to ask, because you were mentioning storyboarding, you know, with The Lion King and Mulan and all these other great films. Those were amazing films, like no doubt about it. And they didn't have the super polish that a lot of these animatics would have these days. You know, where it's like it's almost like it's on fours or something, the entire film. I
Yeah.
wanted to know your thoughts about that, you know?
Oh, boy, it's so interesting that you've really opened up a subject. Boarding and pre-production has so changed. And I do feel I'm not going to be like I'm not going to grouse about the old days were better. I'm not going to do that because there's so many good things and it can really help you. It can really help you visualize things. It can definitely make things look more viable than really they maybe are, in the sense that like Beauty and the Beast, Mulan, those boards were a little bit more spare. They were a little bit faster to create, fewer drawings, and I think you just focused a little bit more on the broad story. Um, the other feature I would say is interesting about this whole thing is that back in the days when we put these on storyboards, after you finished pitching, everybody was sitting in a room staring at the whole sequence. And you would just end up looking back and forth and you would pull these drawings off the boards, fold some over, move some around. And as a director, I've found it much more difficult with people pitching things on Cintiqs, etc., because it's almost like a game. It's like a memory challenge. You watch it and you're like, okay, and now you have to remember the whole thing. And on Crudes, we eventually got to the point where we're like, we're just going to print some of these out. I know they're electronic, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to force you to print these out. We're going to hang them up on a board so that once we see it pitched, we can see the whole thing. And it was funny because like the story artist came in the room and they were like, "Oh, I can see the whole sequence. It's all right here." And you're like, "Yeah, yeah, isn't that great?" You know. So I really feel like a combination of the two things is the ideal thing. If you do have all this pre-production and these boards that are on fours and stuff like that, try to go back to like just looking at it on boards and just take a breath, you know, and look at it that way as well.
Fantastic. What music were you listening to while working on Crude? Somebody asked. Do you remember if there was any
Yeah,
regulars?
yeah. There's a guy named Carrie Muzzy who writes music that sounds like it's from movies, but isn't always from movies. Um, and I can't remember the exact track. I could find it. Um, there's a sequence where the Crudes need to be separated because they've stayed together their entire lives, and we needed to force them to take a, a moment by themselves. So we came up with this idea like, oh, they're going to confront a thing like a maze. They're going to get all separated and lost, and each one in this maze will confront something by accident that freaks them out. And by the time they get through the maze, they will have learned that they can do things on their own. And I found this great piece of music. Um, if you listen to, okay, Dean's amazing board for Mulan stealing her father's armor and running away is a piece of music called Fire in a Brooklyn Theater. It's from a movie called Come See the Paradise. It's an amazing piece of score that was overused for a while for trailers. And I really think that music um, helped sell that sequence. Dean's sequence is amazing, brilliant. It would have sold anyway. But yeah, some of Carrie Muzzy's stuff really helped guide me in the Crudes.
Awesome. Rosie's asking, did Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes have anything to do with inspiring you for the style of Lilo and Stitch? Especially because, you know, you're using watercolors and you don't really see that.
Yeah, I mean, It's so incredibly inspiring. The thing I've always tried to emulate more than anything in my life of drawing, I always tried to emulate Charles Schulz. Um, I never achieved it, but I was obsessed with Charles Schulz, Beatrix Potter, and Karl Barks, who drew some of the best Donald Duck comics. And I was obsessed with all of them for different reasons. And those three artists are the ones that, as a kid, I would sit around and I would try to draw what they drew. I would never trace it, but I would stare at like Charles Schultz's hands, which I love, because it'd just be like, well, I don't know. Anyway, those are my three biggest as a kid.
Fantastic. Here's one I was chatting with Kay the other day, and she was like, "You think there's any such thing as true like artistic freedom when it comes to making your own film?"
I think to some degree, I think that and this actually goes back to the thing that somebody had asked earlier, which is, well, can't you have a little bit of freedom to be frivolous now and then? I think if you have a story that has enough room for you to like breathe, those are your moments where you can really, your story will, again, it'll keep you safe. If you know what's supposed to happen in a certain sequence and you have the room to do it, now you can indulge yourself. You can make that moment great. Ron and John, when they do their films, somebody pointed this out to me. In Aladdin is a good example. A lot of times in Ron and John's films, they tend to state what the scene is about right up front, and then they let the scene play out. It's a way of getting really good clarity. But that's their way, I think, of being able to have a little bit of fun. You know, Jasmine is in her garden. She's feeling frustrated because she just saw a bunch of suitors that were like ridiculous. And her dad comes to see her. And she, right up front, she says, I don't like this situation. I don't remember the wording, but she pretty much says, this sucks. I don't like this. And boom, the whole scene stated, right? And then they can play around with it. You can do stuff with Raja and you can have a little bit of fun. So yeah, you can have a, a bit of freedom so long as you know where you're going and you've bought yourself some time so you don't have to be too hurried.
Here's another one. This one's coming from Anonymous. What are some stories you would like to see in movies and shows? You know, like, is there anything where you feel like there's a space missing for?
That's an amazing question that I will not blather on without knowing the answer, but I need to think about that. That's a really good question. Like, yeah,
Okay, no worries.
good question. I don't have an answer right off the top of the head.
um, let's see here. There's a whole bunch here. Okay, so I'm just trying to read them first to make sure. Okay, so Dela De Del Delgaduck asks, do you have any rules about where to put the act breaks? Like at the 15-minute mark, Act 1 should end around there, or something like that.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. I've worked with people who do have those figures in their heads. Um, Kirk D'Amico, for example, was really good at, like, he's like, well, this is our. I'll be like messing around where I'm like I'm writing and doing things, and he's like, this is our midpoint, and I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, the midpoint. And he'll actually state like this should we're like 30 minutes in or 40 minutes in, we should be at our midpoint and stuff like that. So I'm sure it's pretty easy to look that stuff up, and yeah, there do tend to be some things. Those are rules. Rules are made to be broken. But it's a good thing to just be kind of aware of if you're. I was just thinking, It's a Wonderful Life is such an interesting film to me because most of that film is setup. Most of the film could be argued, I think, that it's like the midpoint of the film is way off center because it's all about this entire experience leading up to that fateful night where everything happens. And now that you've got all this setup, now the whole film is really happening. So that's, I think, a great example of somebody who broke the rules just brilliantly.
I remember reading in Matthew McConaughey's book when he was really into rom-coms. He says in his book, I just flip to page 70 or some page, right? And he was like,
Okay.
that's where the romantic scene happens, and I want to see if it's going to be different, And he was like, I got to the point where I could practically flip through and stop at that magical point.
That's fantastic. I love that. I love that.
Uh, Here's a question here. In all the films you've directed, what's your favorite sequence?
Definitely Forbidden Friendship. Um, is I think the favorite, my one of my favorites. I would say that Dean probably feels the same way. Um, it's such a magical little bit, and we we knew that was going to be like one of the great like pivots of the film. And we had been talking to John Powell about it from the very beginning, from our first meeting with him. We're like, oh, there's a sequence, and it's going to be all yours. It's all yours, man. And he actually admitted later that he was dreading that because he understood like how much pressure was mounting for that sequence to be this really magical bit. And he did it so so brilliantly. Um, so that's definitely one to note.
Fantastic. I got one question myself. Um, if you could have like a little video of any point of your life, something that you don't have, what would that point be? What would that moment be?
That's a really good question. Like if you could magically rewind and take a look at it
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah,
Gosh, there are so many moments from my childhood that I would love to like look at. Um, I think um,
what
it
would you want
wouldn't
to see?
necessarily.
What would make you interested to see that moment?
You know, when I was a kid, my mom died when I was pretty young. And I think I would definitely go back to see just more interactions with her because it all happened in that zone that became very foggy later. And I know that your memory adjusts and changes things. And I would love to go back and see more like how did that really happen? Like when I was in Colorado Springs growing up as a little kid, like all that time is just so it's become like lore in my own head, and I know it's completely inaccurate. um, there is one. So when I was a little kid, when I was a little kid, um, I knew that my dad was obsessed with UFOs because I couldn't read, but I knew that he had all these magazines and they all had flying saucers on them. And he used to subscribe to Saga magazine, which, if you go and look at Saga magazines from that era, they are the most lurid, ridiculous things you've ever seen. And half of them are UFO stuff. Um, and when I was a little kid, we were in the garage and there was this thing on my dad's workbench, and it had a bell jar and a big dry cell battery and a guillotine switch and a bell, like one of those old fashioned bells with a little clapper on it. Um, and I said, "What is that?" And my dad said, "Oh, that's a UFO detector. I got the plans out of Saga magazine." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah." And then I'll never forget. He didn't say if. He said, "When the UFO comes, they are held aloft by electromagnetic force. The electromagnetic force will charge this coil, and it will close the circuit to this dry cell battery, and that power will ring the bell, and we'll know that they're here." When you're that little and your dad says that like that, you're like, "Oh, they're coming eventually. This is reality," right? So I began to have a recurring nightmare that I would wake up. In the nightmare was me waking up in bed, wondering why I'd woken up, and I'd realize I can hear the dull ringing of that alarm from the garage. They're here. And in the
It
dream,
rang, like,
well, in my
or
dream,
in your dream. Okay,
in,
okay.
in my nightmare,
Yeah.
it never actually rang, but in the nightmare it would ring, and I would go to my bedroom door, I'd grab the handle and freeze and think, should I open the door or not? And then I would turn the handle, I'd fling the door open, and in the hallway outside my dad's bedroom were them. and they were on, their hand was on the knob, and they would go, and they'd look over at me, and that's when I woke up screaming. So I would like to see that moment again when he tells me about that UFO detector in his garage.
I love it. I love it. That is hilarious, and that is probably the best way to end this whole talk. We went a few minutes over, so I really appreciate you spending
Yeah.
that extra time with us. Thank you to everybody joining us and for all your wonderful questions, as well as all the mods and all the staff of Lightbox Expo. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to the amazing, the incredible Chris Sanders. Thank you, Chris. This has been fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for helping on this and hosting the whole thing. And thank you. You're brilliant.
All right, perfect. Well, we're out. We're